Well, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Is the mic loud enough? Okay. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. And, I'm so excited to be talking about this today because this truly is, when we talk about root causes in our healthcare system, this is one of the root causes that we need to fix within our healthcare system to fix, some of the symptoms we're seeing of higher healthcare costs, more chronic diseases, higher use of medications. This is getting at the root of it because our children are the future. They're the future generation. And so, we talk about, the financial burden of baby boomers, but when you look at the cost of kids entering our healthcare system, under the age of 10, and there's a lifetime of care that's needed to support these kids, that's an incredible cost and an incredible burden. And, what I'm so encouraged with in working with kids is, compared to working with adults, kids are a bit of an easier fix. And so I'm a little bit biased to my pediatric patients because working with their diet, working with supplementation, working with lifestyle changes, you can see very quick results and very quick changes in them, just changing small things. And so some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today hopefully will spark some ideas, spark some conversation, that we can continue. But what I'd like to present to you today is from our experience here at the Reardon Clinic, what we feel is needed to help develop a generation of optimal kids. So, I like to, with a lecture, kind of give the why, the why behind, why am I so passionate about this? And for me, it started with these two. This is my son and my daughter. My daughter's Evie is 6 and Brody is just about to turn 4. And for me, the birth of my daughter sparked a journey, searching for answers. What sort of, pregnancy did I want to have? What sort of delivery did I want to have? What are we going to feed our kids? Am I going to breastfeed? Am I going to vaccinate? These are all questions that most parents are facing today. And there's a lot of conflicting, a lot of really emotional conversations that are being had about some of these things. So I want to kind of bring this back into the realm of tangible things that we can do and tangible things that I've discovered in the process of raising these two. And of course they always are this well behaved, right? And they're always this sweet, not exactly, that's more accurate of what they're usually like. But they're such a joy, and it's been such a neat experience for me to see them grow and to be my little guinea pigs, as far as what strategies we implement. But that's them. So, the question, before we kind of jump into optimal kids, do we have a problem? Do we have a problem with kids being sick today? That's an important question to ask. And, so really what I'd like to talk about now is how sick are kids today? I think we all kind of see our little bubbles, and I think intuitively parents can sense that, yes, there's something off, with this generation of kids, but sometimes it helps to take a few steps back and look at the big picture. So as of 2014, 1 in 68 kids has been diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. That's up from, in the 1990s, it was 1 in 10,000. So autism spectrum disorders are on the rise. 1 in 8 children suffer from an anxiety disorder, diagnosed anxiety disorder. That doesn't count the kids that get anxious that maybe haven't been diagnosed. 10 to 15% of children and teenagers at any given time are experiencing depression. Again, clinical diagnosable depression. 8.3 million children have respiratory allergies. 6 million children have diagnosed food allergies. I think if we looked at food sensitivities, I think that you would see a much bigger, astronomically bigger number with that, because I think a lot of kids today have food allergies. 9.5 million have skin allergies, and more than 10% of kids have trouble sleeping. So this is a pretty big problem. And, unfortunately, when we go to our conventional doctor, the answers that they give us are medication, which is needed in some circumstances. But what hopefully we'll be talking about today is all the strategies you can employ before getting to that point of medication. Because a lot of times it's presented to parents that that's their only option. That's the only thing that they can do. And in fact, if they don't do that, they're made to feel like less than an adequate parent because that's the treatment strategy. And so I'm here to tell you that there are a lot of other strategies that work, and maybe not for every kid, and there's definitely not a magic bullet, but there are a lot of other things we can look into. So question, are we over-medicating our kids? And again, that's a question I don't think we need to necessarily answer, but I'm just going to give you some facts. 17 million kids worldwide have been prescribed psychiatric medications. 10 million of those are just in the United States. 3.5 million kids being medicated for ADHD. Between 1995 and 1999, this to me was staggering. Increase in antidepressant use by 580% in the age 6 and under population. I mean, can you imagine like being 6 years old? Like, what do you have to be depressed about? I mean, it's you wake up, you eat, you poop, and play outside. There's what is there to be depressed about? And that to me is just such an indicator that that's a symptom. That's not who they are. That it's a symptom of something else going on. Just to go right along with that, children age 5 and under, they're the fastest non-adult segment being prescribed antidepressants. And if you look at adults today, 1 in 4 women are on antidepressants. So these kids' moms are also being medicated. And then as far as antibiotic use, there was a study that was done that suggested 11 million visits throughout the course of the year. Kids were prescribed antibiotics when an antibiotic in fact was not needed and probably would not help the child. So, over prescribing antibiotics, I think is and especially the broad spectrum antibiotics, is definitely an issue as well. So those are the facts. This is kind of where we're at. And, so taking those facts, let's take a look at some strategies and what we've outlined as far as what we believe are the strategies that you can employ, things that you can look into before going down the medication route that will help, in fact, generate more, an optimal feeling, in kids. So it comes down to an individualized approach. No 2 children are the same. You could have 10 kids who've been put in the same bucket with ADHD who all have 10 different reasons why they have those hyperactive symptoms. So this is an individualized approach. Every child is different and has to be approached that way. There's no magic bullets. As much as I wish there were, that would make my job a whole lot easier. There are no magic bullets with this. Healthy diet is an integral part of optimal kids. Proper nutrient levels, so making sure there are adequate nutrient levels. And, we can talk, about why, in our, research and in our opinion, why nutrient levels are lower. But the fact remains that we test nutrient levels and a lot of kids are deficient in certain nutrients. Restful sleep, this is a big one in our go society, making sure kids get adequate, good quality sleep. Movement. This is a big one. And when I talk about movement, I'm going to be talking about not just, exercise for kids, but what does exercise do for the brain? What does movement do for the brain? Why is that necessary? And then, finally, healthy emotions and healthy discipline. And this is probably the one I'm least qualified to talk about, except for, my experience as a parent. But we'll talk about this a little bit, and I put that in there because it has to be a big piece of this. Whether, it's addressed, with an outside counselor or, through parenting styles, this is a big piece to changes that you're going to see within a few days, like putting a child, on a medication. But these are changes that happen over the course of a couple months, but they're sustainable changes, and these are lifestyle changes that we're making for kids. So not only are you changing their symptoms, but you're putting them on a completely different trajectory for the rest of their lives. So there's not a quick fix with this. All right, healthy diet. So when it comes to healthy diet, this is kind of a big topic. And actually, every Tuesday we do a class called Food is Medicine. And, so if you want more information about this, I encourage you to come to that class because in the time we have now, there's no way I'm going to be able to address everything I would love to address with the diet. But for most parents, they, ask the question, where do I start with all of this? Where do I start? Because most of us kind of look like this, when it comes to the diet, and especially with our kids. How do you get your kids to eat a healthy diet? And I'm going to talk about 5 strategies that you can utilize to help develop a healthy eater, at any age. Now, what's most important about these 5 strategies that I'm going to talk about is the order in which you do them. If you go home tonight and you tell your kids, okay, that's it. we're only going to be eating broccoli and chicken and rice, and you try and radically change their diets, they're going to look at you like you're crazy, and they're not going to do it. They're not going to want to do it. So, but if you follow this kind of step by step and kind of gradually start to wean certain things out of the diet, then you'll be able to start introducing foods to see sustainable changes. So my number one strategy has to be, and of course I think most of us, are aware of, is you've got to cut the sugar out of the diet. And as a parent, if you're not actively trying to keep sugar out of your kids' diet, then they're getting too much of it. Because sugar has been sneaking into our food system, like you wouldn't believe. Because we're taking poor quality foods and we're selling them, and to make them taste better, they add a lot of sugar, they add a lot of salt, they add a lot of fats, because those are the things that trigger in our brains, a feeling good when we eat those foods. So if, like I said, if you're not actively looking for sugar in your kids' diet, they're going to be getting too much. And, I give the recommendation, at the very bare minimum, they've got to be less than 40 grams of sugar per day. That's the bare minimum, and that's actually the recommendation for an adult that's on a 2,000 calorie diet. Kids, it actually should be a lot less than that. And what's interesting is the average child under the age of 12 consumes 49 pounds of sugar per year. And when I first saw that statistic, I was like, there's no way that can be right. That's the body weight of some of these kids. There's no way. But when you look at it, 1 pound of sugar is 450 grams. You look at a can of soda, there are 50 grams of sugar in 1 can of soda. So nine sodas and you have a pound of sugar. And so, and then you look at other things, hidden sources you might not think about, like a slice of bread could contain up to 10 grams of sugar. So you give your child a sandwich, there's 20 grams of sugar, you put some jelly on it, there's another 10 grams of sugar. You very quickly can get up to that 50 grams a day, which will put you at 49 pounds of sugar per year very quickly. So, so the easiest way, the absolute easiest way to cut the sugar from the diet is to move more toward a whole foods diet, where you're shopping the perimeter of the grocery store, you're making a lot of the snacks that your kids are eating, you're making them at home, you're making them from scratch, so you have control over what goes in them, using, different forms of sugar like honey or maple syrup, stevia, xylitol, alternative forms of sweeteners are better choices than just using white sugar. And they're definitely better than the alternative that's in a lot of our processed foods, which is high fructose corn syrup. And so I tell families, if you want a fun Friday night activity, this is what we do for kicks, when you have young kids, go to the grocery store, go in the middle aisles and start looking at all the food labels and see how many foods you can find that don't have high fructose corn syrup or corn sugar in them. And you'll be shocked when you start looking at it, that all of the processed foods that we're buying and that we're eating have high amounts of, these sugars in them. And so, long term, there are a lot of consequences to eating sugar. Obesity is a big one. But high fructose corn syrup is probably in the top 5 food triggers that I find in kids, especially with hyperactivity. And so for a lot of these kids, not only is it, a detriment to their health, but it's also, a trigger for a lot of their symptoms. So definitely watch out for the added sugar. So that has to be number one. Just right behind that is clean eating. So again, this goes along with cutting out the processed foods. Beyond the sugar and beyond the high fructose corn syrup, there are a lot of additives and preservatives that are added to the foods these days. And after the lecture on the table back there, there's a handout that you can pick up that has a list of the most common food additives, what you'll find them in. I encourage you, take that handout, take it with you when you go grocery shopping, and really start reading labels, because these additives and preservatives are also another really big trigger for kids and behavioral issues. Again, that right behind the high fructose corn syrup, you take kids off of MSG and sodium benzoate and BHA, BHT, red dyes, yellow dyes, blue dyes, all the food dyes. You start taking kids off these food additives and you'll see a dramatic change in their behavior and their attention. So, and they're chemicals. and they're chemicals that are used because the food industry is a business. And like any business, they're trying to make a profit. And so they're trying to make something taste as good as possible while making it last as long as possible on the shelf. And they're looking at their individual products saying, well, there's just a real small amount of BHA, BHT in this. It's not enough to cause any harm to anybody. But they're not looking at what else is in the diet. They're not looking at the air pollutants we're exposed to, the chemicals, in our fabrics, the chemicals, in our water. They're not the pesticides, the herbicides that are being used on our foods. So we're getting this bioaccumulation of chemicals, in our world, and it's an overload for these kids. And so taking out these food additives and preservatives is a very easy way to eliminate unnecessary chemicals in the diet. Easiest way to do this is, shop the perimeter. Again, if you're buying whole foods, if you're buying a lot of fruits and vegetables, a lot of nuts and seeds, then you're not going to be getting a lot of these additives. And so, so really, really concentrate on getting these out of the diet as much as possible. The last one on here, I actually would love to do a whole lecture just on this topic because I find it so fascinating. But look at the ingredients list for the natural and artificial flavorings. If you start looking for it, it's one of the top 5 ingredients that you'll find in foods these days. And it's kind of this ambiguous, topic of what are these things? And this is something that's really kind of come about within the past 20 to 30 years, where the food industry has gotten really good at mimicking flavors that exist in nature and using them to flavor our food. So they take something like a corn chip and they put seasoning on it, and now all of a sudden it tastes like a taco. That's a Dorito. So you start looking, and they're adding these natural and artificial flavors in a lot of different foods that we're eating. Now you think about it, in nature, these flavorings that occur naturally in foods, for instance, like a carrot, what makes a carrot taste like a carrot are the carotenoids. It's all the nutrients in it. And that is what makes it appealing to us. So if you all of a sudden start taking these natural and artificial flavors, and they start mimicking some of these flavors that exist in nature, you're tricking the brain into thinking that you're getting nutrients, that the food that it's flavoring doesn't have the nutritional, makeup to back that up. So you might think you're eating a carrot because of the flavoring, but there's no carotenoids, there's no nutrients in that. So therefore, there's one theory out there that's why we overconsume a lot of the processed foods, is that our body's craving certain nutrients, it's craving certain things. We think we're getting it from the food that we're eating, but in reality, we're eating food that's flavored in that way, but there's no nutritional value to back that up. So this is a really, really big step in getting your kids to eat real foods. Because as long as they're eating foods that are artificially flavored, then a carrot's never going to taste good. And broccoli's never going to taste good. And an apple's never going to be sweet enough. If you drink a can of soda and then you try and eat an apple, there's no way that apple's ever going to compare to the sweetness of the soda. So as long as we're kind of overwhelming our taste buds and, tricking the brain into thinking we're getting things that we're not, then kids aren't going to crave the foods that they need. But if you slowly start eliminating these things from the diet and you start replacing them with real foods, you're going to find all of a sudden that real food actually tastes good to kids. And we'll talk about here in just a second how you can even jazz up some vegetables to make them taste better. But this has to be the first step in it, because nature can't compete with these artificial flavorings. Actually, and there was a really fascinating study that was done back in the 1920s. There was a pediatrician that looked at 15 infants. Her name is Dr. Clara Davis, and she looked at 15 infants, and this was before they had ever been introduced to solid food. And she had them, when they first introduced food, she would give them a tray of 34 different foods to choose from. And she'd let them pick whatever. They would just be given a variety of different foods. And what they found was that, the first couple weeks that the kids were introduced to the foods, they'd try a little bit here and they'd try a little bit there. But over time, kids started gravitating towards certain foods. And in each of them, it was a little bit different, but they tend to kind of gravitate towards certain things that they would eat at each meal. And what was fascinating is they found that the foods that they gravitated towards were the foods that they were nutrient deficient in. So the best example of this was a little boy with rickets, which is a vitamin D deficiency. He would, each meal, they had a little cup of cod liver oil. Completely unprompted, he would drink a cup of cod liver oil at each meal, because cod liver oil is high in vitamin D. And he would, what kid drinks cod liver oil completely unprompted? He would drink it, and then once his deficiency resolved, he never touched it again. So there's an intuitive nature toward kids. And if you're listening to that, and if you're really listening to them, they'll give you clues, about what's going on, with them and what they're craving. So the second thing to that is continuously introduce new foods to kids, especially if you're taking all of this, the artificial stuff out. Continuously introduce new foods, because you might find that they'll try something, when, a few weeks ago they wouldn't. Yeah, so a great example, this is my son. So, we've got a family history, a genetic thing where we're all zinc deficient. And it's, thanks to, family history. My dad was, I was, and so I was real attuned to it with my kids. And, so before, when Brody I was introducing solid foods to him, I would give him peas. And I found that he would, fist palm peas. He would literally eat, spoonfuls of peas, just, that'd be the first thing on his plate. He'd always go toward. And I was just like, I'm raising a super eater. This is great. And then I started to notice little white spots start to appear on his fingernails, which is a sign of zinc deficiency. And peas are one of the highest vegetables in zinc. And so I was like, this is interesting. So I started giving him some supplemental zinc, and sure enough, he stopped eating the peas. He'll still eat them, but I have to prompt him and I have to remind him. He doesn't go for them like he did before, because that nutrient, deficiency has started to be resolved within him. So that's what kids are very intuitive. Listen to them. If they tell you, I don't want to eat something, listen to that, because I think that speaks to them in their innate intelligence. Well, yeah, that's a great point. And this is where testing nutrients is so important, because in our family, I know there's a genetic reason why we tend to run low in zinc. And so yes, the ideal way would be to be able to fix that with the diet. But for genetic reasons, we just have a higher need than the average person for zinc. And so, so we could continue to give him peas, and that could, correct, that deficiency over time. But, we chose to supplement it. But yeah, you absolutely could use food as medicine. So this, very, very nicely leads into the next one, that give kids the foods that they are really craving. And, this is where, again, listening to your kids and listening to what it is they're craving gives you clues about what they might be deficient in. So, if your child's craving, for instance, bacon, or they're craving high-fat foods, then, they're in their diet, they're able to satisfy that need and that desire for fat with the foods that you present to them. But most likely, that's representing some sort of a need for essential fatty acids in their diet and getting the right types of fats in their diet. So I'm a huge proponent of, giving kids a lot of really good, high-quality plant-based fats. So I have some listed here, avocados, nuts and seeds. If there's no allergy, nuts and seeds are an excellent option. Cook with coconut oil, don't cook with the vegetable oil. Olive oil is a great one. For my kids, especially when they were younger, I would drizzle olive oil on top of all of their vegetables. And they loved it. They would eat their vegetables, because we are biologically programmed to want fat. So let's give them the good fats. Let's satisfy that need in a healthy way. Grass-fed meat, fish, all of those are a great way to give kids the good fat that they need for brain development. Sea salt is the next one. I'm also a big proponent of let your kids with good quality healthy, pink Himalayan sea salt. Let them salt their foods, because in sea salt there's a high amount of good quality minerals in them. And so if kids are craving those minerals, or they're craving salty foods, rather than giving them Doritos or rather than giving them Cheetos, let them get it in a healthy way and let them salt their foods. And so my kids, they could love to do that, and they put it on their vegetables, and between that and the good fats, they have no problem eating most vegetables. Make sure you're introducing a lot of probiotic-rich foods. Kids these days, the gut flora is so important, especially kids who are born via C-section. We're approaching between 30 and 40% rate of C-section in this country, depending on what part of the country you're in. And when babies are coming out of the birth canal, that's their first exposure to the flora, the bacterial flora of this world. When they're inside, they've got a completely sterile gut environment. So their first experience coming out of the birth canal is extremely important for populating their digestive system with good bacteria. So babies who are C-section don't get that exposure, and they've tested the flora of those babies, and they tend to be high in the flora that are on the nurse's hands or that are in the hospital room. And so you're pre-populating kids with the wrong flora. But one way to help compensate for that is just make sure they're getting a probiotic rich diet throughout childhood. Whether that's a probiotic supplement, making sure they're getting yogurt. Coconut kefir water is a great probiotic. There's a lot of different options, but making sure they're getting the good bacteria in their food is extremely important. Colorful foods. Make sure that your kids are eating their colors. A wide variety of fruits and vegetables with lots of color. We're very intuitive by nature, and we're drawn to color in food. That's why M&Ms are colorful, is because they know that we're drawn to that color. So the colorful foods have a greater antioxidant power, and they're going to have more nutritional value. So introducing a wide variety of antioxidant-rich foods that have a lot of color is extremely important for kids. One of the best ways to do that, and I think Aaron might have a handout on this in the back, is to make smoothies for kids. Or you might have, I think you might actually have it at your seat. But make colorful smoothies for your kids. And if your kids won't drink a smoothie, make the smoothie and freeze it in a popsicle mold. Anything tastes better as a popsicle, and that's a great way to sneak in some spinach, sneak in some nuts and seeds, sneak in a lot of whole foods, a lot of colorful foods, that, are so important for kids in their development. All right, number 4, give your child water to drink with each meal. And I even mean this starting from a very early age. If I talk to parents about, their child at the age of 1, substituting cow's milk for water, it's blasphemy. They're like, well, how are they going to get their calcium? Well, if you look, there are quite a few, calcium-rich foods that are just as high in calcium as cow's milk, and that also have a lot of antioxidants in them. So, for as much as possible, if you can encourage your kids with each meal to just drink water. Just drink water, maybe some herbal teas, something to give a little bit of sweetness. We make a lemonade with fresh squeezed lemon and fizzy water and a little bit of stevia, and my kids love that. And so, so finding alternatives that aren't juice or soda, that have high amounts of sugar in them. Sports drinks are just as bad, just as high in sugar, and they've also got all the food dyes in them as well. But even cow's milk. Cow's milk today is not what it was, 30, 40 years ago. Cow's milk today, is laden with antibiotics. About 80% of antibiotics in our country are given to our livestock. So a lot of antibiotics, a lot of steroids. Cows today produce twice as much milk as cows back in the 1970s because they're pumped full of a lot of these steroids to increase production. So, and then after that, the cow's milk is then pasteurized, homogenized, so it's high heated, and that'll kill all the bacteria, but it also kills a lot of the enzymes that would help your digestive tract break down those milk proteins. So milk tends, on a list of common food allergens, cow's milk is very high for a lot of kids, especially if you've got a child with skin issues, with eczema, with GI issues. Ear infections, chronic ear infections, especially when a child, starts ear infections at the age of 1 when they're put on cow's milk. That's always a big red flag to me that there's, a sensitivity with cow's milk. And so there are a lot of other great options, the best being water that you can replace, that milk with. And, it's just going to be a lot healthier for your child, and you're going to cut out a lot of the sugar and a lot of the most common food sensitivities that we see. Okay, so last one is maintain a healthy digestive system in children. And this, again, could be a whole nother lecture just in and of itself, but it goes back to the idea that kids are intuitive eaters. If your child doesn't want to eat proteins, if they'll only eat carbohydrates, you have to ask the question, can they digest those proteins? If your child will only eat a very limited amount of foods, do they have the enzymes? Do they have the bacteria to break down those foods? And so again, you have to assume that they're intuitive in the way that they eat. And if they're eating a very particular way, a very strict way, then you have to start, assuming that there's something going on within the digestive tract. A big one is identifying food sensitivities. We see these very commonly with kids, and these are different than food allergies because food allergies are, tend to be, your anaphylactic, hives, throat closing sort of allergies. They're usually pretty prominent. These are more hidden, delayed sensitivities to foods. So the only way to really be able to identify these is to do a blood test or to completely remove them from the diet for at least a period of 1 to 2 months and then reintroduce them. And so that's, two of the best ways to identify some of these food sensitivities. And I'm going to keep scooting because we're actually getting close to time. Proper nutrient levels, so moving on with our list of optimal kids. Proper nutrient levels is so extremely important. And I've given you a list here of some of the external indicators. If you've noticed any of these, symptoms in your child, chances are pretty good that they have a nutrient deficiency. And it might be that they have that deficiency because they're not getting enough of the foods that they should that contain that nutrient, or they're not able to digest those foods very well and extract those nutrients, or they are like us, there's a genetic reason why they just have a higher need for certain nutrients. But there are quite a few nutrients that go hand in hand with some of these symptoms, and if your child has any of these, the chances are pretty good that there's a nutrient deficiency that is going along with some of these symptoms. So what nutrient is the most important nutrient for kids? Does anybody know? This is our famous trick question. We ask this at almost every lecture, and we like to trick anybody, all the newbies who've never been out here before. Vitamin C, that's top of my list. But the answer is it's the one that they are deficient in, So some kids it's vitamin C, some kids it's vitamin D, others it's B vitamins, still others it's zinc, So the only way we know that is to be able to test for it. And thankfully, technology has improved so much within the past few years that we can now do a lot of this testing via the urine with kids, so that you don't even have to have a stick, a venipuncture done. So we can test for a lot of these deficiencies, but this is the list that I gave you. These are the most common ones we see in children, and these are some of the ones that, for instance, I'll give you the example for my kids. My kids every day take vitamin C. Every day they do a fish oil, they do vitamin D and probiotics, because these are some of the ones that is kind of for the world that we live in, are some of the key ones that we find that kids are deficient in, and they tend to have the hardest time just with the stress of all the detox that they have to do, the stress of all the different antibiotic things that they're exposed to. These are the things that we find are some of the most important and some of the most common deficiencies in kids. All right, restful sleep. So restful sleep is so important for kids, and I bring this one up because of our lovely invention of electronics that we have. Almost every kid these days has a tablet or an iPhone or a TV in their room, and light interferes with the production of melatonin in the brain. And melatonin is the hormone that kind of signals your brain to fall asleep. So if your child's watching TV before bed or playing on their tablet before bed, they're not going to be, producing enough of that melatonin hormone, and they're going to have a hard time falling asleep, or they're going to have a hard time having a restful sleep. So I recommend, turn all electronics off. If you can, turn most lights off about 30 minutes before bed, and that's going to naturally stimulate melatonin production in our children. And this makes sense. When you look at our ancestors, they didn't have all the lights that we have today. So when it started to get dark outside, it was very intuitive for their brains to signal that it's time to go to sleep. So for kids who have a hard time sleeping, which hard time sleeping often goes hand in hand with some of these behavioral issues. And in fact, you can even kind of start to see this very early on in infants. The infants that won't take naps, or the infants that have really poor sleep habits very early on, very often are the kids that continue to have poor sleep habits as they get older, and they tend to end up with some of the behavioral issues. And I've actually seen kids that the reason they have ADHD is because they're just tired. They're not sleeping well. The one child did a sleep study and found out he had a not sleep apnea, but something similar, and his airway was closing and he was waking up all night. As soon as they fixed that, took out his tonsils, hyperactivity went away. So, that's why I say there's a lot of different root causes, and kids sometimes when they're tired, the way they display that is they get more hyperactive. So magnesium has great calming effects. So magnesium before bed for kids is a great way to kind of calm them down. Making sure that there's a consistent bedtime, a consistent nightly routine is also important, to kind of keep kids on track and on schedule, and, getting them to bed at the same time will also help with improving their sleep patterns. Movement. Okay, so this one is near and dear to my heart as a chiropractor. And my training as a chiropractor is actually in pediatrics and pregnancy. And a lot of my training in pediatrics is in the realm of functional neurology. And when you start to look at how kids' brains develop, movement is so critical to their brain development, because most of the brain development up until the age of 2 in children is centered around helping them develop their movement patterns. They learn to contract muscles to sit up. They learn to contract muscles to crawl. They learn movement patterns of walking. It's no coincidence that as soon as kids get comfortable and steady with walking, all of a sudden language appears and they start talking, because the brain starts developing, when they're born, they've kind of got primitive brainstem connections. As they're learning movements, they start connecting into some of the subcortical areas, into the basal ganglia, into the cerebellum, and these are all centered around coordination of movements. But as soon as those connections are made, that's when kids start connecting into the neocortex, and that's where learning starts to occur. So there is a very definitive order that this happens, and milestones in children are extremely important. You want to make sure they're hitting all milestones and hitting them in the right order, and spending an appropriate amount of time with each milestone, because that's an indication of brain development. So with movement, the way our brains develop, our brains are kind of like a self-powered battery. The brain is the battery that powers our movement, and our brain tells our body how to move. But it's all the movement of the body that then in turn powers the brain back. It's like this really beautiful feedback loop. So with kids, if there's a lack of movement, there's a lack of time outside running around, a lack of time playing, a lack of time, exploring new things at the park, new ways of movement, that can have an impact on brain development. And if you don't believe me, look at a child who is on the autism spectrum, who does have learning disabilities. And what you'll find is these kids very often have poor posture. They have a weak core. They tend to, have forward head posture. They tend to have clumsy movements. Those are the kids that the parents are like, yeah, they just never really got into sports. It's because they don't have a good grasp on their movement. And so, movement is so key, for brain development. Also, movement is key with obesity, and I've given a few statistics here with obesity. Again, this could be a whole nother lecture in and of itself, but obesity in children has doubled in the past 30 years, tripled in adolescents. In 2010, more than 1/3 of children and adolescents were overweight or obese. And this third one, to me, is really concerning. When they studied 5 to 17-year-olds who were overweight, 70% of them had at least one risk factor for cardiovascular disease. These are young kids. Talk about entering our healthcare system very young. And we test a lot of disease markers in young kids, and very often we see high C-reactive protein, which is a cardiovascular marker. We see, and it's also, a marker for inflammation. We see, high homocysteine. So we see some of these markers in kids, and it's very concerning. But the hope with this is these are all dietary based. So this all goes back to what we're feeding our kids and the amount of movement that they're getting. And so, so a lot of this stuff, in majority of kids is very preventable if you take on the right lifestyle habits. All right, healthy emotions and healthy discipline. Like I said, I'm sure there are people that could speak to this a lot more, expertly than I can. But a few things that I have learned and that I do know is that, kids crave routine. They crave consistency, they crave boundaries. If one parent is telling them you can't eat sugar, but the other parent is taking them out for ice cream, there's a disconnect. And that's very hard for kids to understand that. And so there has to be consistencies and there has to be boundaries within that. I encourage, people, talk to your kids, and really listen, because, like I said, they're very intuitive, and very often they'll give you all the information you need about what's going on with them if you're just kind of attuned to listen to it. You can't encourage your kids enough. Encourage them. Kids, working with kids, especially with dietary restrictions, a lot of parents think that kids are the worst and they're the hardest as far as dietary restrictions. And I've actually found that my kids who are patients are some of my best patients, because as soon as they can make the connection between how certain foods make them feel, they are on board 100%, and they will stay away from certain foods. And so, so encourage them in that, and help them, kind of explore that. And then the last one is let kids be kids. Sometimes I feel like we're kind of in a hurry to make kids grow up these days. There is a certain nature in kids that they are hyper and they are high energy, and that doesn't always mean that there's a problem. I also have seen a lot of kids that have come in that I'm telling the parents that I don't think your kid has ADHD. There are some root causes we can deal with, but kids are by nature, a bit on the active side. And so kind of letting them be that, kind of grow into that, sometimes is the best thing for them. So to end this section, I want to leave you with two quotes, from people who are much wiser than I am, talking about, talking to your kids and listening to your kids. I love this quote. She says, "Listen earnestly to anything your children want to tell you, no matter what. If you don't listen eagerly to the little stuff when they are little, they won't tell you the big stuff when they are big, because to them, it has always been big stuff," which is so true. In their little worlds, everything is a big deal. And then last one, I really like this as far as like letting kids be individuals. Everybody is a genius. If you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. So kids don't always fit the mold. Kids are going to have certain strengths and they're going to have certain weaknesses. Doesn't always mean that there's something wrong with them. So that's all I have. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you guys for coming. Yeah.
I do have a question. It seems in recent years, the gluten intolerance thing has been a big, very common.
Right.
You didn't mention that at all. I just wanted to know what you thought.
Yeah, so the question was that it seems like in recent years that gluten intolerance has been a big topic of conversation. And why did I not mention that in the lecture? And I would, absolutely 100% agree. I think that's part of a bigger conversation, regarding food sensitivities. And I think what we're still trying to tease out with that is the why. Is it really truly the wheat? Or is it something in what we're doing to the wheat? A lot of wheat today is a type of wheat called Roundup Ready. wheat. They use Roundup Ready seeds, where the ag industry has developed seeds that grow a plant that's resistant to the herbicide Roundup. And so they can spray this herbicide all over the plants, and it won't do anything to the wheat, but it will kill the weeds. So is it the amount of herbicides that we're using? With wheat, we've genetically altered wheat to where, wheat today, it's much, the stalk is much more straight and much more firm because it holds a heavier head of wheat. And therefore, the starch content in that wheat is much greater to where on the glycemic index now, wheat falls higher than sugar. So not that everybody, fits into a mold or, and again, everybody's an individual, but I would say the majority of my patients, I ask them to go gluten-free because that makes such a big difference for a lot of them. And so, and for some kids, it is the actual sensitivity to the wheat. For some, they're sensitive to the yeast in breads. Again, others, they're sensitive to the high fructose corn syrup that's put in a lot of breads and processed foods. And so, but I personally don't think it's necessarily something just with the wheat, because I've had patients who can't handle wheat here in the United States that do just fine with it over in Europe. So it has to do something with, I think, the processing of the wheat, but it is a big trigger for a lot of people. Absolutely, that's a great question. Yeah?
I want to address two things.
Sure.
The first would be first foods for babies. We have a 1-year-old
Mm-hmm.
planning on having more kids. And so like first foods, like our pediatrician said, rice cereal at 6 months, exclusively breastfeed. So I just want you to address that, like what would that look like?
First foods, yeah.
For
Yeah.
first foods. And then the other part would be like as far as probiotics.
Yeah.
Like what, because I know you're talking about the dairy and how we process it and stuff like that.
Hmm.
If we're trying to avoid processed dairy like yogurt and kefir and stuff like that,
Mhm.
what would you recommend?
Yeah.
Feeding.
Good probiotics. Yeah. So those are great questions. So the first question was, what first foods would you introduce to an infant? Because most pediatricians recommend rice cereal as kind of a first food. And the first part of that, I encourage parents not to introduce rice cereal in infants who don't have teeth. Because if kids don't have teeth, they have not started producing the digestive enzyme in their saliva to break down carbohydrates. So, and I see a lot of people, especially kind of in my generation where our parents, started rice cereal when we were 4 months old. The sooner the better, get them sleeping through the night faster, fill them up, and I see a lot of rice sensitivity, which may be connected, may not be, but rice has historically been very, hypoallergenic for a long time, but I see a lot of food sensitivities to that. So I actually, a little story, I actually have a patient that I'm seeing that is 12 months old, and she has not gotten teeth yet. This speaks to the intuitive nature of kids. So she doesn't have any teeth yet. She's being breastfed, is in very healthy weight class, little bit on the chunky side. She's so cute. But pediatrician has prescribed to the mom for her to get occupational therapy and physical therapy because he's concerned that she's not eating foods. And so she'll eat foods, like she'll eat cheese, she can swallow cheese, but she just doesn't want anything else. They'll put it on her tray and she just doesn't want it. And so, intuitively, she doesn't have teeth, so of course she's not going to be wanting to eat foods. She doesn't have the enzymes to help start breaking that down in the mouth, so intuitively she's avoiding it. So as far as first foods, I actually encourage something called baby-led weaning in parents because it's presenting options to kids. Of course, I guess I should back up and say number one is breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is absolutely one of the best things, and if you are, continue that as long as you can. And as long as you're breastfeeding, there is absolutely no reason to introduce cow's milk at all when they turn one. But introduce, when they have teeth, introduce, foods kind of in a solid state, so starting with foods that are real soft, like avocados, bananas, start with foods that they can grab, but as long as possible, when you have control over what's put on their tray when they're young, I would say avoid any processed foods as long as possible, so stay away from anything that comes in a box. Avoid the temptation to give them, all of the goldfish crackers and, all of the processed foods, all of the quote baby foods, and just stick with real foods. And some babies, and baby food, making your own baby food isn't a bad thing at all either. And I encourage you, if you do baby food, to make it yourself. But what I like about the baby-led weaning is they're in charge of what they're putting in their mouth. And so they will intuitively kind of go for what it is that they need. So.
Not puree foods then?
No. And that's where, every child's a little bit different when you would introduce that. Some kids, are fine with that at 7, 8 months old. Some kids, maybe it's closer to a year. But as long as you're breastfeeding and as long as they are, still, gaining weight and they're healthy, then there's no other reason to have to introduce, solids and food, at that early of an age. So, and then to answer your questions with the probiotics, if you're breastfeeding, best way to do it is for mom to get probiotics. And so, make sure mom has a healthy gut, healthy probiotics. We have a probiotic that's an infant probiotic that's easy to add, to, water, or, breast milk that you pump and give it to the baby. Or some moms will even just have them sprinkle it on their nipple before they breastfeed, and the child gets it that way. But if there isn't an active concern, what you're producing in your milk is probably all that they need, and I wouldn't start supplementing with that early. So, yeah.
Kind of along those same lines, I have a 2-year-old that still doesn't eat very well. She's nursing.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think in terms of like the intuitive nature of if she likes certain foods or is drawn to certain foods or not?
Mm-hmm.
At what point should I care? I mean, I'm not worried nutritionally that she's getting enough.
Right.
Or if maybe it's a sign of something else.
When you say picky eater, what does she like to eat?
Mostly like crunchy, salty, the little bit of like carbohydrate stuff that we give her. She doesn't really eat any meat.
Won't eat any meat.
A
Yeah.
lot of beans,
A lot of beans, yeah. I would say, by the age of 2, because the question was, she has a 2-year-old that is still not, eating a variety of foods. She's still breastfed. I would say by 2, that's when I would start thinking probiotics, and I would start, at that age, introducing probiotics. We actually went through this with my daughter around the exact same time, and she was very similar. She'd eat sweet potatoes, black beans, and yogurt. That was about all she would eat. That's about all she would eat, and she would eat them well, but when we started introducing probiotics for her, then all of a sudden her palate opened up and she started trying, more foods. So it could be, a gut flora issue with her.
And is there a brand you recommend in particular?
The brand I recommend is one called Claire. And we have it upstairs, and the reason I recommend that is it's hypoallergenic, because a lot of the strains of bacteria are lactobacillus, so they're made from milk, and so if there is a milk sensitivity, you don't want to be giving a probiotic that's triggering that sensitivity. So those are completely hypoallergenic, and they're made in the dosing for infants, so in children. So yeah.
So if you're introducing yogurt to kids, is it benefiting them if we're just buying it at the regular grocery store, or should there be a special yogurt that we're seeing?
Well, with kids, the first question I asked with yogurt, the question was about yogurt. Is it still beneficial if you're getting it at the grocery store? And what makes the stuff at the grocery store not as beneficial is the fact that they put a lot of sugar in it. And so if you're getting just the plain yogurt and maybe adding stevia to it or some honey or berries to sweeten it, then yeah, you're still getting a probiotic effect from it. They still have good probiotics in them. But because of the taste of yogurt, that's a big one for hidden sugar. If you look at some of the pouches, you could have 20, 25 grams of sugar in one serving for children. So you have to be careful, because the sugar will negate some of the good effects of the probiotics, because it feeds yeast and it feeds candida in the gut. So, but yeah, if you're getting plain yogurt, I would, of course, highly recommend organic. But if you're getting organic plain yogurt and sweetening it yourself, then yeah, they're getting a lot of great benefits from that. So, yeah.
What's your comments on the rice arsenic combination?
Yeah, the question was about the rice arsenic, combination. And so, yeah, I honestly, probably am not as well versed to be able to speak into that in any detail. There has evidence has come out that there are traces of arsenic in rice. I don't know the quantities of it to know, how serious, that is. like I said, rice is always, a little bit of a red flag for me because so many people are sensitive to it. And so for other reasons, I recommend, kind of keeping an eye out for rice. But I honestly, I can't speak to how serious, that issue is. So. Right, yeah, there are reports that have come out, and especially I think it's the rice from China that's the worst. And so, buy United States rice. Any other questions I can answer? All right, well, thank you guys.